I wanted to share some comments based on your first posting, some important points, and some points that you all brought up that I think were important and wanted to expand a little bit on. A lot of you seem to delve into what this representation involves, that there's a lot of impacting factors on schools and our students that are coming from this outer circle of politics, laws, cultures, the community, the actual organizations, and then the networks within schools really impacting our schools right now. For some context, for those of you that may not know, where we have ended up really started with the Nation at Risk in the 1980s. And that was the first time where the mainstream media kind of picked up on the narrative that our schools are failing our students. At the time, interestingly enough, we were actually in a fairly good place, and our standardized test scores were increasing. But this narrative and the title really was picked up by the mainstream media. And we really have gone in this direction with No Child Left Behind and Common Core state standards. And in a few places, people had mentioned how we are not performing as well as other countries. Yes and no. Linda Darling Hammond, in this book that I have here, claims that if you were to take out the lower socioeconomic status schools in our country, the urban and rural schools that are very poor, our students, therefore mostly suburban students, would probably be very competitive with the world's population of kids. So as much as the narrative of politicians and media is that our schools are failing, and they're not perfect, it really is an issue of socioeconomic status and access to education and what type of education you receive if you are a poor student living in urban or rural school districts. So that is something to think about. That's obviously her perspective, and she has some data to go with that. You don't have to agree. And I'm not saying that suburban schools are perfect and we shouldn't work on changing them. They do need to be changed, but it really is an issue of access to education, and we often ignore in all of our schools, suburban, urban, rural, helping students to think critically about what they're reading, issues of social justice, and really engaging students in creating and representing their learning as opposed to just reproducing or memorizing for a test. So obviously with No Child Left Behind, we got into this era of test, 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 and measuring and comparing schools based on these test scores. Which obviously, as I think a few of you have pointed out, this led to this rote memorization and repetition and mostly skills-based learning as opposed to engagement in more challenging project-based learning. And I think, some of the students who were involved in this whole No Child Left Behind from their kindergarten years to graduating high school have now just begun going to college. And I think some of the challenges we might be facing at the college level is we focused a lot in early reading education on phonics and decontextualized skills as far as answering questions on worksheets. It was less about creating meaning and more about answering test questions. So Common Core state standards really has been created to raise the bar again, because No Child Left Behind really did lower the bar as far as not expecting a great deal out of our students. So we really need to think about how we can change our instruction away from what we've been focused on in the past with these decontextualized skills into skills that will transfer, strategies that will transfer between subjects. I picked this comic because I think most of you probably know that, well, I think Common Core state standards were well intentioned, They mostly did not invite many teachers to the table, and when they were invited to the table, oftentimes, especially when you get policymakers and politicians involved, they're ignored or their voice is squished a bit. So obviously the "Do you know anything about teaching" fits, I think, quite well. So there are its own problems with Common Core. A lot of this wasn't field tested before we tried anything in schools, so as we started to roll this out, we found issues. And as many of you probably know, a lot of the packages and programs that we buy aren't necessarily the most relevant to Common Core state standards, despite what they claim. There's actually 2 specials on NPR this week about Common Core state standards that talk about this, so I would look them up if I were you and you were interested in this. And just one more point about our Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan. He was a businessman who happened to run Chicago Public Schools, and I'm told he supposedly did it well. But this is often the issue with education, is people who are not educators make the policy and run schools, but they don't know a whole lot about being an educator and what it actually means. President Obama had the opportunity to possibly select Linda Darling Hammond, who I mentioned a few slides ago, but pretty much he was told that she would not get confirmed because she was too teacher-friendly, too pro-union, and that's not what we want to be seeing these days. There's a pretty large privatization movement of education that goes well against what teacher unions stand for, and there's a very long history there that I won't delve too much into. But just a point, Waiting for Superman certainly was written from one perspective, as any media, this particular presentation is written from my perspective. You don't have to believe it. You could tell me I'm full of doo-doo. That's fine. It's my perspective and what I've read and what I know. And you don't have to agree with me, but just realize that the people who created Waiting for Superman had their perspective of really pushing the charter school movement and really pushing privatization of public education. And there's quite a bit out there that pushes back on that, especially with the charter schools in New York City and how they tend to take up space in actual public school buildings, and public school children in New York City tend to get pushed to the side for charter schools. So there are opportunities if you wanted to look more about that. Just be a critical reader and thinker and know that everybody has their own perspective in what they're creating. So despite the fact that this is a technology class, I'm not saying that technology is the silver bullet. It's going to fix everything. It's going to motivate kids. Be a little bit cautious about thinking about this as a great motivational tool. It certainly can be, but not all students are motivated by technology. Not all students want to use technology all the time. A lot of students are happy drawing or using other tools. It's really, technology is a pedagogical tool that can promote student learning, but it's really how you use this tool in your classroom. There are lots of other tools that also can promote learning and also can promote motivation, just how you use this tool. So I posted a picture here of this old wine, and there's always a danger with technology that you get into this metaphor of old wine in new bottles. Are we just taking what we used to do with a pen and paper and shoving it onto technology without really thinking about what technology affords us the opportunity to do that we cannot do without it? So for example, I've watched a lot of students do their publishing of writing on the computer. That's fine. We all need to learn how to type. Computers are really important and you need to know how to type. But that's really just replacing technology, replacing pen and paper with technology. You don't have to publish on the computer. You can, or you can handwrite it again. We play a lot of math games and literacy games that really could be played in person with a physical game. So for example, if we're making different phonics sounds or whatnot, do we really need an iPad? Maybe not. So this is this notion of old wine in new bottles. Are we just repackaging the wine in something new and calling it something new when in reality it's the same thing? It can be very motivating for kids to play these types of games, and there actually are a lot of games that are much more interactive that you wouldn't be able to get that type of interactivity if you did not have the technology. And that's really where I want your mindset to start going with technology. I've encountered one more point about this, lots of people who have smart boards but never use them as anything more than a glorified overhead or a glorified whiteboard. That's not the purpose of a smart board. The smart board is there to be interactive, to engage students in a different way that shouldn't be possible without the technology. The little triangle here, I don't know how familiar any of you are with Bloom's taxonomy. From about the 1950s is when it was originated, I believe. This has now been recreated, and the top levels have been called evaluating and creating. So creating is the top level of Bloom's taxonomy. So that should be the highest level of cognitive activity that you engage in. The lowest level is really where we've been in education. It's remembering, understanding, sometimes applying. But we tend to not get into these higher levels very much. It's not necessarily valued in our school system. We can't really test it, or we choose not to test it, quite frankly. We could test it if we wanted to. We really test these lower levels, and that's where we've been in education. What I'm really kind of proposing to you, this is called the SAMR model. I'm not having you read necessarily about it. It's a technology integration model. But what really happens in this, substitution and augmentation really are kind of the lowest levels of technology integration. Substitution would be what I talked about earlier, the publishing. There really is no functional change. Things don't really change if you handwrite your final report versus type it. Augmentation, there's a little bit of a functional improvement, but not a whole lot. Modification is really where you get to these analyzing and evaluating levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And redefinition is really where I want you to start thinking about tasks that were inconceivable without technology. Obviously, I think I've mentioned I don't consider technology to be the be-all, end-all. There are lots of great uses of technology, but there are a lot of different ways to engage students with multimodal creations that don't involve it. We're not going to talk a whole lot about that because this is obviously a technology class. So I really want you to think about how can your students be creating? What can they be doing? What sort of apps could they use? What sort of websites? Even with the PowerPoint projects you're going to be doing, it's a pretty old system to be using PowerPoint, but there are lots of interesting things you can do that you're not going to be able to do with a pen and paper. So again, I'm just trying to highlight that this is where I want you to really be thinking this evaluating and creating part. I just want to take a moment. I know a lot of the readings are very focused on literacy, but in my perspective, literacy is integral in all of the content areas. Math, social studies, and science, they're extraordinarily related, and you really can't be literate in any of the content areas if you're not literate in general. And each one of these content areas is going to have their own specialized language and vocabulary and whatnot. So when you're thinking about what we're reading about, how does it apply to your content area? So if you're thinking about math, what could your students be doing with technology to represent their learning of whatever concept you're reading or learning about in math? Same thing with social studies and science. There has been quite a bit of work, a lot of them at University at Buffalo, in these different content area literacy with technology, without technology, more focused on multimodality. So that information is really out there, and if you're interested, I can get you some resources about that. With the short timeline of our class, I didn't want to leave you all lingering without definitions. These are my definitions of new literacies, multiliteracies, and multimodality, which you don't have to agree with. I've done extensive reading in this area, so that's really what's shaping my definitions. The two approaches to new literacies comes from Lancashire and Noble. I think I pulled this out of their most recent book. It was 2011. And there are two different approaches to considering new literacies. One definition of new literacies is the going against the original idea of what literacy is and really thinking about the social practices involved with literacy. The other would be any new social practice or technology, and these are constantly changing and constantly available. So I do kind of approach things in both ways, but I tend towards this more idea of new literacies as thinking about literacy as social practice. Multiliteracies, in how I see it, is very connected to G's idea of discourses, languages in use within social and cultural practices. So there are multiple discourses, there are multiple literacies. And I realize my definition might be a little bit different than, say, Paul and Rosell if you look in their definition section, and that's okay. I've read different things than they have, and I've shaped my definition differently. And again, you don't have to agree with me, but just having multiple cultural and linguistic discourses. And then multimodality is making meaning that includes multiple modes of communication. The sad part about doing this is I've actually been gesturing the entire time I've been talking. But clearly, because I'm not webcamming this, you don't see that part of it. So that leads into my comment of all communication is multimodal. But as you probably know, we tend to be very linguistically focused in schools, and I'm arguing through this class and through the projects you're going to be doing and what you're reading that we really need to consider more of a multimodal approach to education.